Good morning. We're going to start in a couple of minutes. I'm running a little late today, like every day. And hopefully start soon. I'm turning it on before so that people know that the broadcast is on the way. Shalom Aleichem. Gentlemen.
Yeah, I know they bring in Bachli. Yeah.
Burning a hole in your pants? My wife was very impressed. I showed her the letter, I showed her the response. She said,
Your wife?
yeah. Dumbfounded.
Why you?
Not yet.
אני לא רואה שאתה ממהר, זה הולך יותר מהר.
אבל זה עושה לי תחושה כאילו שזה הולך יותר מהר.
אומרים רצח עין.
כן. השם יסלח לי אתמול. יעקב ואני כתבנו לרבי ביחד.
איזה יעקב?
יעקב כץ. כשאני כותב איתו אני מקבל תשובות. אז הוא אמר לי, נו מה הקבלה טובה? אז הוא הציע לי, אולי תגיע בזמן. אני אגיד את זה, זה אפילו פעם אחת אני לא אציע.
צריך להיות אנגלי.
משהו נורא. טוב.
אנשים רואים פרסונות אצל מישהו אחר.
Okay, so let's continue. So we talked yesterday about that we don't feel that we came from anything, let alone that we came from God. And that's called our feeling of yesh me'ayin. So we're on page 254. דהיינו שהנברא הוא בחינת יש ודבר נפרד בפני עצמו. And this comes because of our feeling of separateness. והגם שהיש הנברא הוא גם כן כלא חשיב כמי, and even though what we call the created being, there's also non-created being. The non-created being is Hashem, obviously, who's not created by anything. So even though even though it's considered like nothing before him, דהיינו שבטל במציאות לגבי הכוח והאור השופע בו מהכלים ד10 ספירות דאביה, שהקו אור אינסוף ברוך הוא מאיר בהם, כזיו השמש בשמש, כמו שגם מבואר בליקוטי אמרים חלק ב', היינו כמי דווקא. So even though really there's no existence, even for the created existence, why does it say even for the created existence? Because the whole point of created existence was for it to feel that it's independent of anything. And yet, even then you can even feel it to some degree, that there's a life force that's sustaining being. Without this life force, there would be no... And so today we call this order. We say there's entropy, that everything is heading towards its disorderly demise, and yet there's something holding it together right now. What's holding it together? So we don't know. We have all kinds of theories about what this force is. In the Far East, they call it chi. And there's a lot of theories that say that chi is really the word chai. It's Seder.
It's a very
It's a subtle thing.
premortal sexual type of.
Oh, there's also that, but not
Yes.
necessarily.
No, but I'm
Qi
saying that
is the
that's-
general life force in the East, in China. I'm talking about China.
All right.
There's even a theory that the name, how do you say China in Hebrew? China. Okay, so there's a theory that the whole idea of China was around Chi, around really it's like Chi, Chi.
Abraham's sons, yes.
No, maybe.
Yeah.
We usually associate them with the Hindus and the Buddhists, but it could be that it's also China. So even though, and today in the West, we call this again, we have this force that we don't know. We saw a letter yesterday from the Rebbe. It says that even today in Western science, there is a search for the grand unifying theory, which is to look for a force that governs everything. In the end, keeps it all together. We don't know what this is. But we theorize that it exists. The Chinese also don't know what Qi is, but they theorize that this exists. We know there's something keeping us together, but to see that we are nothing, that only Hashem can see. To see the being as not being, as nothing, kelo. Kelo means like nothing, or in its original sense, Lamed Hey in Daniel, it's chapter 7. So it means the dust of the day. It's like the dust that you see through a window when the sun shines through it. You see dust particles in the air. That's what it is. That's what all this is. It's like dust particles. So to see it that way, only Hashem can see it. We continue to see ourselves like we exist. We're very permanent. We don't have a beginning even. It's like we created ourselves. Only Hashem can see it otherwise. And this is the top-bottom perspective. But from below to above, from our perspective, we really are something. We really exist. You can't say that we're nothing, and you shouldn't treat other people that way either. The biggest mistake that people do when they learn Chassidus is the first thing they say is, obviously everything else is nothing. And they retain their feeling of self. That I do exist, but everything else doesn't exist. The truth is, if you can say it about yourself, then say it about yourself. But about everything else, you have to have the bottom-up perspective. Nobody's going to let you have a top-bottom perspective because that means that you're like God. What are you looking at me like a God from above, from your Olympus? It doesn't work that way. Because the sustaining power, the power that runs through us, cannot be grasped at all. You can't even measure from one perspective to the other. You can't translate. There's no translations. From the bottom-up perspective to the top-bottom perspective, there's no translation. There's nothing you can borrow from one to the other. They're so different. And how do you say this in Chassidic language, or actually philosophical language? Ha'alul is what gives birth to the ilah, meaning there's a cause and effect. Sometimes we call it sibau mesovav, which is like cause and effect. Sometimes we call it ilah and alul, which is a little bit different, which is like the genitor and the progenitor, or what came into being and where it came into being from. That's ilah and alul. We're not talking so much about cause and effect, but rather origins. What is the origin of something? So, the way that the alul sees the ilah, the way that what was generated sees the progenitor, שהעלול יודע ומשיג איזו השגה בעילתו ובטל אותו על ידי ידיעה והשגה זו, וגם במהותם ועצמותם אין הפרש גדול כל כך, רק שזה עילה וזה עלול. So there, we said that's like the child and the mother. The mother is the progenitor and the child is the genesis, is what came out. So there's still some understanding. He says, relatively speaking, there's not a big difference when you talk about it that way. שבין מהות היש הנברא למהות הכוח והאור שופע בו להוותו מאין ליש. But when it comes to us feeling where our life force comes from, the distance is incommensurate. You can't even compare it to the person understanding that he came from his mother. For the genesis, or what was generated to understand where it came from its progenitor, is much, much easier than to understand this force that is flowing through us and sustaining us, making us from nothing to something. And again, the nothing here just means not that what came before me is nothing, but rather that it's inconceivable to me. I can't grasp it, so it's called a nothingness. So all this he copied, where from? From, I guess he took this from Tanya at some level, but it's not in Tanya. I don't know where he took this. Ad kan leshono. I don't know. I don't know where he copied this from. It seems like a long quote, but Uviud varav. Maybe this is from the Ramban, like we said. I don't remember that the Ramban says all this. I don't remember that Nachmanides says all this, but maybe it's not his language. It's probably from the Tanya somehow. From Uviud varav. Yeah, it's from the second part of the Tanya, from the Shar Yuchid Vaimuna. Uviud varav sheba lever ma'u efresh ben bria le'atzilut. Another way of saying this is that this is the same thing as explaining the difference between someone who lives in the world of creation and someone who lives in the world of emanation. Bria and Atzilut. שבריאה בלשון הקודש הוא על התהוות מציאות נבראים שהם בבחינת נפרדים. Bria, meaning creation, in Hebrew, he says, in the Holy Tongue, means the coming into being of creations that are separate. Separate from what? From their origin. That they can't trace back to their origin. What do you mean when you say Atzilus? Atzilus should be like Bria. It should be the same type of word, which is like, I think it's called gerund. I don't know. I never know enough English grammar to know what it's called. But you take a verb and you turn it into a noun. So bara becomes Bria. I think it's probably wrong. I don't know what it's called in English. So Atzilut should also be the same form. So when you say that something is ne'etzal, why did the Mekubalim they started using this word Atzilut? Now in general philosophy, it's also called emanation. That's why we translate it that way. It's not my translation. This was already chosen by much greater people, that the way to translate Atzilut is emanation. And this is an old thing, and it actually came from Plato. Plato was the first one to talk about this. And whereas Aristotle only had from creation and below, Plato only speaks about emanation. Now, even though Aristotle came after Plato, he discounted that theory of emanation. He didn't like it. Later on, it showed up in Plotinus. It's considered to be by the academics, he's like the father of Kabbalah. Why? Because he has this whole language of emanation. In any case, be things as they may, you know that I'm not afraid of us borrowing from someone else because they got it wrong anyway. So we take the terms and we take them through our sieve of Torah, and then we fix it. We make it so that it's godly. So even if it came from Plotinus, it's not an issue. Maybe it came from him, but it probably didn't, because again, these things were probably the other way around. That the Greeks learned from the Jews. I once talked about this. In the old history books, if you read the old history books, not the new ones don't agree with anything of this. So Plato met Jeremiah. How do you fix the dates?
Yeah,
that's why they threw it out.
Some people think it was Shimon Tzaddik. Some people say that Shimon Tzaddik.
So Alexander definitely meant Shimon Tzaddik. That's documented in the Talmud. So that's at least 100 years later. How does that work? Because Alexander was supposed to have been Plato's student. So there's, ancient history is a little bit of a riddle. People call themselves by name. Everybody calls themselves Pharaoh. Everybody calls themselves Xerxes. They all have the same names. So the question is, how many Platos were there? How many Socrates were there? How many Again, when they learn, it's interesting that the non-Jews know, the historians knew this about all the other lineages, and then they did this to the Bible. They said, oh, there's more than one Isaiah. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's more than one Jeremiah. So he says a number of people who are called by the same name. But then they discounted the fact that in the other, eventually they gave up that the lineages of the non-Jews were the same way. And they were left only with the Bible having that. It's all, you pick and choose whatever you want. It's not a clear. Now I just heard yesterday that a new definitive study came out that Columbus was a Jew. Now it's definitive, because now it's genetic. It's political. Yeah, and they know if he was Sephardi because of the genetics. Why it's all political. Why is it political? Because now that it is out of style to be American or Colombian in the sense of with the U, that you're oppressor, right? You're an oppressor. So now, so it's got to be a Jew. In any case, so getting back to real world things and not people's imaginations, there's this thing called emanation. What do we mean by emanation? So he says emanation is completely different than creation. In emanation, you also protrude, you come out of the source, but there's never any disconnect. So when we think about why a tzaddik, we say that a tzaddik has the consciousness of the world of emanation, what we mean to say is that he constantly feels that he's coming out of Hashem. He doesn't feel that he's Hashem. He came out. It's not the same thing. But it's a completely different type of relationship. And what does this relationship look like? So he says that it's not being separate, but rather, hanetzalim b'bchinat bitul legamre. They feel complete nullification before their source. First of all, that means they acknowledge their source. They understand where they come from. Keziva shemesh b'shemesh. In the same way that the radiance of the sun recognizes its source in the sun. This is a very interesting thing because before general relativity, I don't know what this meant. What do you mean that the ray of sunlight knows that it's part of the sun? What are you talking about? And according to general relativity, the sun doesn't radiate; it expands. Really, what's expanding is space-time, and the ray of light is just expanding with it. So actually, the sun's never going; it's not radiating anything; it's just expanding. So that grasps a little bit of what a tzaddik feels like. He feels that I never left my source. It's my source, but I'm just an expansion of my source, and I'm an extension of it. But really, the source is expanding. So where you see a tzaddik is like where you see Hashem. That's why it says in the future, this Isaiah ends his book with, that people will bow down to the tzaddikim. Yechezkel also ends his book that way. The people will bow down to the tzaddikim. Why? Because they'll understand that this person is different. He doesn't have the consciousness that I have. He doesn't have the consciousness of the three lower worlds where I'm separate from my source. He'll see that this person has a consciousness which makes him part of the source. And when he's part of the source, it's something else. You can bow down to part of the source. There is such a thing.
Yeah, but how do you explain with the angels? We said the angels, they perceive how they're being created.
Right.
We say that they're not Chassidus, they're Bria. They're not Chassidus, they're angels. So
there's no angels in Atzilus, right, usually.
So, but they do perceive how they're being created. So how
right.
does it fit here that they are at a lower level?
Very good question. First of all, that's why the Rambam says that they perceive more than we do. Because somehow they don't fall for it. They realize that they have a source. But still they don't feel like they're part of the source.
They just feel they're being created.
They've come to a recognition, meaning they're smarter than we are. But probably not, still not at the level of a tzaddik. That's why we say that the whole idea in Chassidus that the Alter Rebbe writes about this a lot, that what the soul can reveal to a person, even Elijah can't reveal to a person. Elijah became an angel. So we have this thing, Gilui Eliyahu. Gilui Eliyahu means a person has a sudden understanding that he couldn't have normally. That suddenly he makes a leap of understanding. That's called a Gilui Eliyahu. We said that that comes from an angel. But what the soul can reveal to a person is much, much higher, much more impressive and profound. Okay, so end here, because apparently we have to end.